Line changes in 49 Quick Decks hockey is an important part of the game, and that's because it's an important part of any hockey game. At the start of the period, you're going to select your lines. For the AI teams that are being run by the solitaire charts, you're going to take your first forward line, and you're going to put your first defensive pairing out on the ice, and you're going to put a marker on each one to signify they're on the ice. Now, how do you decide when they change lines? Well, the action comes from the game action deck or the ice action cards. And after there's an ice action card, there's one of two things is going to happen. There's going to be a stoppage in play. There's a goal scored or the face-off from the goalie holding onto it or puck was out of play. So there's a stoppage in play, in which case you're going to rotate lines. So you just move the cubes down. Or if the play goes through the game action deck and there's been a save and there's a change of possession and it calls for another ice action card, well, before you turn over the next ice action card, you're going to switch lines again. And then you're going to turn over the ice action card, you're going to review it, and same thing. One of two things is going to happen. There's going to be a stoppage in play, or it's going to call to go back to an ice action card, in which case you're going to switch lines. Now, when you're doing rotation of lines, it's important that you keep the same rotation going on. And so again, for the solitaire teams, you're just going to go from line 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 and then back to 1. Now, keep in mind, there's some special rules for what goes on with the fourth line. And this sheet here comes with the game, and it's one of the cards, because you can actually separate these. It's on your solitaire chart. And it talks about the fourth line and how the fourth line forwards, they only need to play one segment in each period, once per segment in each period, except for they don't need to play the final segment of the third period. Same is true for the third pairing defenseman. So when you're rotating through, you can go to the third line, they go next, go back up. You could go now to the first line with the forwards, or you could carry on and go to the fourth line, knowing you want to get them out once per segment. And the segment is defined by the ice action cards. Remember, you're going to have 7 in the first segment, which is then denoted by having this first segment marker. And so you want to try and get that fourth line out once, and same with your third pairing defenseman out once as well. Now, just a little caveat, especially on the defenseman, you might want to look at how often they played, and you do that by looking at their time on ice. So some teams will have their first pairing defensemen are out there, 21 minutes, and their third pairings are out there for 19 minutes. In that case, I'm just going to rotate through all the time. A lot of teams, though, have got a dominant defenseman, like Boston did in 2018-19 with Charlie McAvoy and Zdeno Chara. They were playing 23, 24 minutes a game, in which case their third pairing defensemen of Brandon Carlo and John Moore would only go out for that one shift per segment per period. Now, there's times during a game when special teams happen because there's a power play, and if there's a couple power plays within a segment, the fourth line might not get out on the ice. Well, don't worry about that. That's not that big of a deal either. Just try and get them on the ice the next time that they would rotate through. And so that brings up the point where how do you decide who comes out after a special team? So we've got Boston here, and the way I play special teams as well is if the top line was on the ice for Boston and there's a penalty on, and say got St. Louis is who they're playing in the Stanley Cup Finals, and there was a penalty on them, because their top line, you can see it's the same guys, Bergeron, Marchand, and Pastrnak. When I go to the power play, I would start their second line. If any other line was out on the ice for Boston when there was a penalty called, second, third, or fourth, then I'm going to go to their first line power play. Okay, I'm not going to worry too much about the defenseman. And same with short man. Here they've got Noel Acciari and Brad Marchand out on the ice. Well, if they were on the ice, so if it was line 1 or line 4, then I'm maybe going to start line 2 for Boston on their short man. And then how about coming out of the power play? So if a power play goes through, and I don't like to call it minutes because it's cards, and some of the cards last longer than others. Some are, more than what would be a minute, and some are less than what would be a minute. But there's 4 cards that go into a power play. And so 2 cards go for one line and 2 cards go for the other line. At the end of that, how do you know what to go back to? Well, for Boston, you can see they've just had their top line out. They've had Krejci, Heinen, and Backus out as well for their second line. So the rule of thumb on special teams, if you're coming off a power play, you're going to go to your third line, and you're probably going to go back to your first line defenseman because they've probably not been on the ice. However, if they have just been on the ice, then you're maybe going to go to somebody, a pairing that's not been on the ice. Same thing coming off a short man. Depending which line was just out there, you're likely going to go back to your first line. Well, in Boston, this is the one team that's going to break a lot of these rules because Patrice Bergeron is the second line short man center. And he also is the first line. So I probably wouldn't go back to the first line. Maybe this is where, coming off a short man, maybe I go to my fourth line. Well, Joakim Nordstrom, I guess maybe you wouldn't do that because he's on there as well. So maybe I'm going to pick my third line to go back onto. Don't get too crazy about that. The basic way to play the game, though, is going to be when you're coming off a power play, you're going to go to your third line and your first line defenseman coming off a power play. When you're coming off a short man, you're going to go to your first line forwards and your first pairing defenseman. That's the basic way to play. And just remember, we're not capturing every moment in a hockey game. There are some breaks in there. So just for simplicity's sake, that's the easiest way to do it. If you want to add a little layer of realism to it, then go back to what I just said. If you want the simple route, which is typically how I play, I just like to flow through the game because I get in, I just get the flow going. I like to keep it going. So I don't really want to take a whole lot of time to see who's on the ice and who should be coming out on the ice. I'll go, if it's off a power play, I'm going to third line. If they're coming off short man, it goes to first line. And what that does too is it mixes things up because the opposition is going to go differently, right? So if Boston was on the power play, they're coming off the power play, so they're going to have their third line forwards out, their first pairing defenseman out. Where St. Louis is going to have their first line out because they've just come off a short man. And so now you've got their first line out against the third line. And that is something that happens in every single hockey game, in every single period, in what I call the segments now for the history of hockey. That is what hockey does. It's not always, I'm going to put my first line out against your first line. Coaches try to do that. It starts that way. They try and manage that the best they can, but it always gets messed up. And so there are things in 49 Quick Decks hockey like the TV timeouts or being able to call a timeout, and that allows you to do a little bit of a reset. Now, you get that reset mainly if you're playing the home team, and 49 Quick Decks hockey, the home team's on the right. So you get the advantage because the opposition is going to have to put their lines out first, and then you get to match with what you're doing. So after a TV timeout or after a timeout that's been called by one of the teams, you can, or even an injury timeout for that matter, you get to switch a line. So if Boston, this is how they were going out, and that's the end of the final card of the segment. So we turn the last card over, segment's done. So in modern day hockey, as 2018-19 is, that's a TV timeout. So the next lines up would be, they would have their fourth line forwards and their second pairing defenseman. But because we had the TV timeout, they could rotate through to their first line, and they could rotate, if they wanted to put their third pairing defenseman out with their top line. So you always get that chance to rotate a little bit. There's one other thing you can do when you're not using the solitaire charts. You could do for the solitaire charts too, but it's a little bit more work. And that is, say you wanted to have Boston's third line out against St. Louis's first line. So that's the start of the period. So we go back and we get these cards all set up. We're ready to go with the start of the period. And I want Boston's third line out, and I'll put them out with our top pairing defenseman to play against St. Louis's top line. And then I'm going to rotate the other way with my forwards. I'm going to go to the second pairing, and then I'm going to go to the first line with the third pairing defenseman. As long as you keep that sequence going, that's okay. That's okay to do. And keep that sequence going through an entire segment. At the end of a segment, if you are like, okay, that just didn't work for me. Now I can switch a line. I'm going to rotate back the other way. Those are little things that you can do. And remember, this is your game. You're really not going to break the game too much unless you keep your top lines out far too much. or you are doing things in a way that adjusts the total shots on goal, because that's how this game is driven. It's driven by shots on goal. So having said that, however, you have the option, and again, this is back on these cards here, where you talk about the top 2 forward lines and the top pairing defensemen, and they get to double shift once in the second period and once in the third period. So for the solitaire chart teams that are being, by the AI, the first time the first line is going to be out on the ice, or the first pairing defenseman is going to be on the ice, that's when they're going to double shift. The way I show the double shift is when they're out for the first time, I move these tokens over to the right-hand side. That shows they're doing the double shift and they've done the first card of the double shift. And then when that's completed, it's, instead of a line change, I'd move it to there and then they'd be done. Maybe I want to do the second line forwards and get their double shift done next. So I'd put that marker there. But remember, it's just the top pairing defensemen that get the double shift on the defensive pairings. And so that's just to bring into account the fact that as the game gets more into clutch time, these top lines do tend to get a little bit more ice time. Okay, well, that's about it for changing lines. Watch for some of the other videos on the rest of the gameplay on 49 Quick Decks Hockey.